The Early Life and Ministry of Billy Graham, Part 1. The Early Life and Ministry of Billy Graham. Billy Graham was indisputably the most influential evangelist of the 20th century. His evangelistic messages reached a larger audience than any in history. How could it happen? Where had Billy lived? What had he done? Who were his mentors and teachers? Was he unusual? How had Billy Graham become Billy Graham? 1. Kindling Prayer. In May 1934, a group of men and women in the dairy farm of William Graham had gathered to pray for the rapidly decaying spiritual condition of the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. The peak of the prayer time came when Vernon Peterson, successful local businessman, prayed the boldest prayer yet. Lord, we pray that you would raise up somebody to preach the gospel around the world. By then, the Christian faith had not yet captured young Billy's heart. William Graham, Billy's father, was awakened to his own spiritual need in the early 1930s, though he had had some previous religious commitment in his life. In 1932, William was nearly killed in a farm accident that shook him out of his spiritual indifference. After being struck in the face by a piece of wood propelled by a mechanical saw, William was rushed to the hospital with a crushed jaw and other injuries, and his condition remained uncertain for several days. In response, Morrow, Billy's mother, called her friends to intensive prayer. What began as a dangerously uncertain prognosis turned hopeful as healing began and the surgeons were able to reconstruct William's face. This answer to prayer and the seriousness of the accident rekindled the faith of both William and Morrow, who saw evidence of God at work. While God was at work in the hearts of William and Morrow, Billy's faith journey needed to take its own path. Even 2 years after his father's accident, he had not yet taken the faith as his own. During those years, Billy was a hard-working, fun-loving soul whose heroes were athletes rather than preachers. In short, Billy was a very natural earthly youth. He was not groomed by his parents to be an evangelist. He was chosen by God. God was superintending something far beyond the hopes and expectations of the Graham family, and something especially different from what Billy had hoped for in his youth. Though Billy's young heart wasn't completely committed to the Lord at that time, the Lord had chosen him as his man, and he would pursue him in the coming years until Billy finally surrendered. Within a year, God began to answer their prayer in the dairy farm, though the ultimate answer would unfold over the next half-century. Early in 1934, when 6 members of the Christian Businessmen's Club gathered together with 2 pastors in an office building in Charlotte, the Reverend Archie Dillard informed the group that he had heard reports of successful meetings held in Augusta, Georgia, by a fiery Oklahoman evangelist named Mordecai Ham. Excited about the possibility of having Ham preach in Charlotte, they invited him and his song leader, Walter Ramsey, to come at their earliest convenience. The evangelistic duo accepted the invitation, and meetings began in the late summer. These meetings would prove to be an answer to the men's prayers, fanning the spiritual flames in Charlotte and stirring the heart of the young Billy Graham. Two, Fire on the Sawdust Trail. Billy Graham was spiritually dead, so when the revival meetings came to Charlotte in the late summer and early fall of 1934, he took little interest in the meetings. Many in the city of Charlotte were not exactly eager to have Mordecai Ham hold a campaign in town. Itinerant evangelists had a reputation as surly, money-grubbing hypocrites. Mordecai Ham was a 57-year-old preacher who had held revival services for the past 33 years. His revival campaigns throughout the South had led to thousands of decisions for Christ. But his methods often left rifts that wouldn't heal, and towns were left divided over his legacy. The city council also got involved in the controversy, holding several meetings to discuss whether they would grant permits to allow Ham to build a tabernacle structure within the city limits. Despite the objections, and with 400 supporters of the measure in attendance, the council voted to allow the meetings to go forward. The construction of a 5,000-seat tabernacle could begin, with sawdust covering the uneven ground below. The Ham meetings began on the night of August 30th, 1934, and ran throughout the fall, stirring the city of Charlotte with the movement of the Spirit of God that would eventually extend into the heart of 15-year-old Billy Graham. The controversies that had followed Ham to every city where he held meetings heated up in Charlotte in late fall as the evangelist found his target to preach against in some unruly local high school students. He caught wind of illegal misdeeds occurring at Central High School from the confession of a person in the inquiry room, where those who responded to the invitation would seek prayer and counsel. Allegedly, some students were going to a secret brothel across the street from the high school during their lunch hour. Along with his legal counsel, Ham had gathered affidavits from witnesses and began preaching about the activity in his services. The accusations went both ways, with Ham's critics accusing him and his piano player of gross immorality of their own, and even sending prostitutes to their hotel rooms to try to catch them in the act. The plot failed, and the accusations against Ham appeared baseless. But his allegations against the high school students were not. The swirling controversy also led to opposition from members of high school. None of this opposition fazed Ham, who was hardened by years of discord surrounding his ministry. As Billy began to read about the immorality at the high school and heard about how Ham held up against his critics as a fighting preacher, he became intrigued about the ringleader of this supposed religious circus. His interest was piqued enough to go see for himself. Despite the ongoing controversies, Mordecai Ham's services were having a significant spiritual impact on the Charlotte community. Billy's parents had already been to meetings at the tabernacle. Billy finally decided to go in November 1934. As Billy sat amid the largest crowd he had ever seen in his life, and Mordecai Ham preached against sin, Billy began to wonder how the preacher could possibly know so much about him. Had Ham spoken to his mother? Billy was deeply convicted of his sin that first night. and he went home pondering the preacher's message as he looked across the fields of his father's farm. He felt drawn to return for several nights. One night, he felt under such conviction that he hid his face behind the head of a woman who sat in form of him to escape the glare and pointing finger of the evangelist. Another night, to escape the eyes of the convicting preacher, Billy decided to sit in the choir behind the podium. What he did not realize at the time was that it was not Ham's eyes they were trying to avoid. On one particular night, Mordecai Ham delivered a message from Romans chapter 5, verse 8, on the love of God. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Afterward, Ham gave the invitation and his song leader, William Ramsey, led the congregation in singing, "Just as I Am," and almost persuaded. During the second hymn, Billy left his seat in the choir, placed his feet on the sawdust trail, and committed his life to Christ. That night, he returned to his home, where for the first time in his life, he knelt down on his own initiative and prayed to God beside his bed. On that day, in November 1934, there was a drastic change in the life and heart of Billy Graham, and there would be no turning back. The prayers of the men and women on the Graham dairy farm that spring were being answered. But there was still more work to be done in the heart and maturation process of the young men who would be called to preach the gospel around the world. To be continued in part 2.